Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here tonight. And as I was telling Stacy, it's always exciting when I see some of my regular people do the thing, they get published, which is awesome. Um, so, Stacy, I'm really proud of you, and I'm proud of the whole group you belong to. You guys are so supportive of GGP. And Ginny, thank you for being here with us tonight. And I'm really looking forward to this. But let me just tell you a little bit about Stacy. Stacy is I'm just going to tell from a personal perspective. She's a GGP person, which we love. Yay! And we love to support our GGP people when they publish. So I loved your book for one thing. It was really not what I expected, which is always nice. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to you guys. So please welcome Stacy Stokes, the author of Remember Me Gone, and in conversation with Ginny Myers Sain. So let's go ahead and welcome him here.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm so excited. And thank you, Ginny, so much for joining. I am such a fan of yours. I gobbled Dark and Shallow Lies up, and just having you here with me is such a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Oh, you are so welcome. I am so glad to be here tonight. This is, I get to do this every so often with debut authors, and it's such an exciting thing because I was there, not very long ago. So I know, how exciting that is. So I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about your book, Remember Me Gone, which I absolutely loved. And I'm just really, really thrilled to find out a little more about you and a little bit, behind the scenes about the book. So I guess we'll jump in. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about the story? It's such an unusual sort of premise and an interesting idea. Just tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so Remember Me Gone is the story of Lucy Miller. Her family runs the Memory House in a small border town called Tumble Tree, Texas. And she has always wanted to take memories away just like her father. And now that she's 16, she can finally do that. But when she goes to take her first memory, she sees a flash of something she's not supposed to. And it sets her down this path of realizing that maybe memory taking is not everything that she thought it was cracked up to be. And she uncovers a sinister plot in her town and realizes that there is more happening in Tumble Tree than meets the eye.
I mean, that's such an interesting idea, that this family with this ability to take people's memories, because who doesn't have a few memories you think you might want to get rid of, right? How did you come up with that idea? Where did that story come from?
So it actually came from an episode of the show True Blood. I don't know if you're familiar, but it was based on the books.
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
Based on the books by Charlene Harris, I believe. So I was a fan. I watched them, and there's an episode where somebody in the town basically hires a vampire. This is just going to sound really strange. There are no vampires in the book, but somebody in the town hires a vampire to erase her husband's post-traumatic stress syndrome by getting rid of his memories. And I was watching this episode, and all the vampires have these side businesses. And I was like, why don't they just have a memory taking business? Feels like you would make a lot of money doing that. And then I was like, that's interesting. And started thinking about it. And that's kind of boom. That's where the idea came from.
That is really cool. I mean, it's interesting that the places, it's always good to hear where writers get their ideas. That's a really cool story.
Yes, but no vampires. I feel like I always have to preface that story by.
Other vampires are great. I mean, I love vampires, but no vampires in the story, definitely. So one thing about this story that I really loved is the setting of Tumble Tree, Texas. And because I'm in Oklahoma, I'm in Tulsa, Oklahoma right now. It's dark here. I see it's still daylight there, which is nice. But being someone who grew up in Oklahoma and who's spent a lot of time in Texas, that setting of Tumble Tree was the first thing that really snagged me about your story. I mean, I love the characters and I love the whole plot and the premise, but it was that setting that drew me in initially because it felt so real. I mean, I felt like I know this town, I know these people, I know the way they talk, I know the way they live. That's such an interesting thing. Like, what was your inspiration for that town of Tumble Tree? Is that a place or a place, a mixture of places?
Yeah, it's definitely a mixture of places, and it came from a few things. I think first and foremost, when I was thinking about the idea, I liked the idea of this destination that's like almost like a roadside attraction in a small place that you really have to go out of the way to get to. There was something fun about writing that kind of close-knit community and then just imagining people journeying to this place. So I grew up in a suburb of Dallas, but before it became a big suburb, it actually was a pretty small town. And then as I was growing up, all these different highways sort of sprouted up around it. And now you can't call it a small town, but I remember there being woods here and there was a dirt road and we had to leave town to really go and have like a fancy meal somewhere or even go rent a video. So that's always stuck with me. And then years ago, I read an article that talked about how when the first highway system was built, that where they chose to put those exits mattered, and that if you were in a town that didn't get an exit, you were kind of doomed unless you had a big industry that could draw people into it, or you had a big attraction. And that always stuck with me, like what a strange thing as a highway designer to have the power to figure out what towns live and die. And if you're in one of those towns, how hard must that have been to figure out how do you lure people in to create industry? So as I was thinking through this story, I liked this idea of a place that people had to travel to, but also a place that didn't have a highway exit. What would that look like? Almost a place that was as forgotten as the memories that people came there to forget. So that started to weave. It was that old idea that kind of wove its way into this town. And then the desert setting, I've never lived in a place that had a desert setting, but there's just something, an extra layer of texture that I liked the idea of. Not only is it this far away, forgotten town, but it's dry and it's desolate. And it just gave me a lot to play with as I was imagining what that world could look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, it was the first thing that really drew me to that story. I grew up in a town in Oklahoma that was on Route 66. And so back Payday was very, like a popular stop. But then when the interstates came in, got bypassed, so that certainly rings very true. And that whole sort of forgotten town setting just really absolutely had a ring of truth to it. So that's really interesting to know. That's really
it's
cool.
funny you say forgotten town. That was actually the original title of the book. Oh,
really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great title. That would be a great title.
Forgotten Town. And then when we pitched it, by the time I started submitting to agents and then eventually pitching to publishers, it was called The Memory House. And we changed it to Remember Me Gone as it went through the revision.
I get that. Yeah. Dark and Shallow Eyes had like 4 titles. So I know that journey to find the right title. That's always fun.
Well, I have to ask, because I'm sure there's a lot of folks on the call who aren't familiar with Dark and Shallow Lies, and it was such a good book. Can I ask that you share a little bit about Dark and Shallow Lies with everybody?
Oh, yeah, I'm glad to do that. Dark and Shallow Lies is kind of like, it has a lot in common with Remember Me Gone as far as it is set in a very small rural town. And that is somewhat of a roadside attraction, a destination, not a roadside attraction because there are no roads, where my book is set in the bayous of Louisiana, in a little town that's only accessible by boat. There are no roads, but it is the psychic capital of the world. And it's a town that's known for having psychics and fortune tellers of all kinds. And it was actually inspired by we stumbled upon a town in Florida called Cassadaga, Florida, when I was on a road trip with my son a couple of years ago, that actually calls itself the psychic capital of the world. And it's just this tiny little place. And I thought, wouldn't this be a really interesting setting for a story? So I sort of took that setting and plunked it down in Louisiana. And that's where the idea for Dark and Shallow Lies came about. But it is similar in that it's a very isolated rural community with some sort of magical, mystical elements and abilities about it. So that's one of the things that I loved so much about your story, is I do love those small towns sort of with a hint of magic stories that just drew me right in. Absolutely.
Yeah, same. That's one of the things I love so much about yours. I felt like we had that setting, scene, small town magic component in common.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that I thought was really interesting about your story was, as soon as I started it, I was so interested in that character of Lucy. She was she felt so much like a real girl. She had all of these regular problems, but she had some that were not so regular as well. So I guess my question would be, she's born into this family that has the ability to take memories from people. You know, and I started out thinking, you know, that would be kind of nice. I mean, we all have things, a high school boyfriend or two, or something that we would like to have erased from our memories, like a particularly bad day at work, right? So, I mean, if that were something that we could do you think that that's something you would want to do, or do you think it's a good thing, or how would you feel about knowing that ability existed?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I had a lot of time to think about, is it good or bad while writing this story? And I think Lucy as a character goes on that journey too, because she starts out at the beginning of the book. All she's ever wanted is to take memories away and to leave Tumble Tree. These are her two dreams. And by the end of the book, some things change, and those may no longer be her dreams. And I think kind of like Lucy, if you would have asked me when I was Lucy's age, would I want my memories erased? Absolutely. To forget like that stupid thing you said, or the ex-boyfriend, or whatever it was. On the surface, I think it seems really nice. But now that I'm a little bit older and I have the beauty of hindsight, I think those bad things, those mistakes that we made, they're so important to developing us as human beings. You need the bad stuff to happen so that you can learn and get better. And as Lucy goes on her journey, she starts to realize that there's another side to memory taking, and that maybe you need some of those bad things to happen to you so that you can become a fully realized human and you can become a better version of yourself. Otherwise, you might be doomed to keep making the same mistakes forever. Because how would you know that you've done that before and it was a stupid decision if you can't remember it? So she, in some ways, realizes that you don't want to be a part of that vicious cycle. So I'd like to think I would have been at that age, eventually get wiser and not make the choice, but I could see how it's very alluring.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's another thing I think that this book has in common with Dark and Shallow Lies, is that idea of a gift or a special talent. That is maybe a little bit of a double-edged sword, you know, that you come into the story thinking, wow, how cool would it be to have this ability? And then you slowly come to understand, you know, all of the weight and the responsibility and the problems that come with that. And I love the way that developed over the course of the story. Really cool. What do you think, what was the most challenging? Now, I hate to ask this question because I've written a book and I know that it's all challenging. So believe me, I understand that that's the legitimate answer. Like, it's all hard. But what was the most challenging part of this particular story to you, or getting it, you know, from concept and the seed of that idea to this actual book? Like, what was the hardest part of that journey?
Yeah, there's a lot, I'm sure, that I can't even remember. The irony of that, because I put it all behind me now that it's done. But I'd say two things. I think one, the story is told in first person present, which I wanted to do because I wanted the reader to get to experience things. But it's also a book that involves memory loss and memory taking. So there is a point where the reader knows more than Lucy knows, even though it's told real time, and navigating that narrative so it's not annoying as a reader, where you know and you want to shake her, I think was certainly a challenge. And I'm fortunate that I belong to a very talented group of writers, a critique group of women called the Pandem Math and Science Club. I think they're on this today, and they often help steer me in the right direction when things went a little bit astray. But that was one piece that was tough to navigate. And the second piece, when I was first trying to figure out what is the mystery in the town, I knew there was memory taking and something bad happened, but I was still working through it. And I had written a scene that involves, I'll just say, crates. And I'll try not to spoil too much for those that have not read it, but I didn't know what to put in the crates. And I played a game with my critique group that was literally called What's in the Crates? And I had written down all of these ideas, which if folks on the call have not read it and they read it, you can laugh because the answer seems so obvious, and hopefully it feels very threaded throughout the story, because the book is much different than it was in that early draft I was working through. But figuring out something that was satisfying to put in those crates was quite a challenge.
You know, I love that, because yeah, it does feel like that has to be, you know, so it's interesting to see how some of those things that seem so obvious take us a while to figure out about our own stories, you know, things that we are literally creating. And I love that you mentioned the critique group too. Hi guys, glad you're here, because that's such an important thing for a writer to have, that support group, because you have to have somebody to bounce those ideas off of. That's such an important thing. So that's really cool to hear too. So I have another question for you. Specifically, what was your favorite scene to write in the story? And then I'm going to tell you, because I have a favorite scene that I'm going to tell you just why I like it in a minute. But I want to hear what your favorite scene is.
There's 3 scenes that I loved writing, and anytime I'm not a outliner. I'm more of like a pantser, just kind of flying by the seat of my pants, figuring out where the story takes me. If the what's in the box story didn't already tell you that. But I always have a couple of scenes that I know are going to happen that I'm writing towards. So when I finally get to that scene, it's like a treat to myself. Like I made it this far, but also it's this thing that's been building in my head that I've been building towards that are really rewarding. One of those scenes is actually probably the primary inciting incident when Lucy follows her dad to the mines, and her dad and the mayor, and starts to realize that there's something sinister happening in her town. And trying to think, do I spoil it or not? But we see Lucy potentially get her memory erased. That was a scene that was really fun for me to write, that I was building towards, that I knew was going to set the whole story forward. And then the other 2 scenes, there is a scene with a mirror. That was another scene I knew I was writing towards. That one was really fun because you start to pull out the emotion and the loss, and you start to see just how far Lucy has come in her feelings about memory taking and everything that's happened to her. So it was kind of sort of this big emotional climax. And then the third one, again, I'll speak vaguely, not to give any spoilers, was when a woman from Oklahoma comes back to the memory house. And we learn something pretty critical that also sets a lot of the next stuff forward. And I knew that scene was going to happen. So that one's closer towards the end, and it was really fun to get to write that one.
That's cool. I love that you mentioned like writing towards specific scenes, and because I do that a lot too. A lot of times my book ideas start with a snippet of a scene, and I don't really know what that scene is or who those characters are, but I know I know where they are and what they're talking about, and I'm kind of writing toward that moment that came to me. So that definitely makes sense to me. Absolutely. I have a little favorite scene in the story. A lot of times when I read, my favorite moments are the little bitty ones, that aren't necessarily like huge plot pivotal moments or the major like swing points in the story. But there's a very kind of small little scene that happens between Lucy and Marco in the park. Which is absolutely one of my favorite scenes. And the reason I love that scene, I'm not going to spoil anything about it, but the layers of discovery there and the layers of realization are so nicely done. And the way it all just kind of comes together bit by bit. And that scene is really, really beautiful. And that was one of the first scenes that I came across that I thought, oh, wow, this is going to be, I'm in really good hands here. This is going to be a really interesting book. So I loved that one. And I love both of those characters too. There's so many interesting characters in this story. Did you have a particular favorite character when you were writing it, or is there one that you enjoyed writing more than the others?
Yeah, I mean, it's told from Lucy's perspective, so she's an easy favorite, but the one who surprised me was actually Manuela. She was originally just going to appear in the first scene you see her in the park, and then she was going to go away. But then she kept popping into a few other scenes, and I ended up making her sort of a major player in the discovery of this mystery. And as I got to know her, initially she was just going to kind of be this stereotypical mean girl, and I like the idea of why not make them friends? Why not turn this could be enemies into friends who decide to figure out what's going on in their town together? So she was a pleasant surprise. She also is a little bit snarky and kind of adds a comedic element, which is just fun when you're building a story that's full of tension, to have something that can release that tension. So
oh yeah,
it was fun. Unfortunately, I had to pull her back because in some of the earlier drafts, I was having so much fun writing her that she was actually overtaking Lucy, like the main character, which doesn't really work when you have a story told from perspective.
It's funny how those characters have ideas of their own sometimes about, I've definitely written characters that I thought were going to turn out to be one thing. And then they have told me that is not actually who they were, and they had a different story to tell or a different role to play. So that's fun how you kind of figure that out as you go along.
Yeah, she wanted
So-
to be the star for sure.
Well, maybe she has another story. Maybe she's the star. I always, what do they say? That she's the star of her own story somewhere, right? In some alternate universe, maybe.
Right.
So tell me, because I know, that this is your first novel, right? Your first published novel. Tell us a little bit about your writing journey. How long have you been writing? Have you written other things before this? Or how did you get to from where you started to where you're sitting here on the release day of your first novel?
Yeah. So I've written on and off all throughout my life. If you would have asked me what I wanted to be when I was growing up, I would have said a novelist. I'm going to be on the New York Times bestseller list. And then as life happens, I've taken a meandering path there. But a little over a decade ago, I decided I really wanted to finish a book and try to get it published. And I did finish a book. It actually was briefly published by a small press. There's a whole side story there. So it was out in the world, but then not out in the world. So that one never really went anywhere. And I had a couple of other stories and manuscripts that either I never finished for all the right reasons because they were terrible, or that never really landed, which now that I have the beauty of hindsight, I can say they weren't ready yet. So that takes me up into about 4 years ago when I started writing The Memory House. And it just felt, actually it was more than 4 years ago that I started writing it, but it just felt different and it felt special. And by that time, I feel like I had all these other practice books under my wings. I had tried to get agents and all of those things. And I had the stripes, as you do. I definitely have racked up well over 100 rejections, but The Memory House was different. And it actually happened pretty quickly. My wonderful agent, Joanna McKenzie, who hopefully is on the call as well. She was in my first batch of queries and I had sent them out. And I think she responded within a week or two with an offer, which just after that whole long journey is like, wait, what? My dream agent is right here. And it only took a couple of weeks. And then we did some revisions and went out on sub. And the same thing happened within about 2 weeks. We had an offer. So it was a very long journey, even though it was very quick when it came to this book. So all exciting things to see that childhood dream come true.
That is very cool, and that I think is the way this business sort of works a lot of the times. You have years and years and years of nothing happening, very slow, lots of waiting, but then all of a sudden everything happens sort of at once. So yeah, I think that's kind of a common experience. I know you have at least some background in improv, right? You've mentioned that a little bit on Twitter. I think it's in your Twitter bio and some things like that. And that's really interesting to me because my background is in theater. I've taught and acted and directed, mostly taught and directed theater, for years and years and years and years. That's actually my real job. But one question I get asked a lot is how does that work in the theater sort of inform your writing? And for me, that I know that it definitely does. So I'm curious to know, does your background in improv, tell us a little bit about that and if you think that sort of informs the way you look at writing at all.
Yeah, definitely. So I moved to Chicago years ago, and I didn't know anybody except for I started making friends at work. But honestly, I just wanted to make friends that I didn't work with. And Chicago has this whole improv underground theater group because of Second City. They also have a number of other theater companies. So I did it to make friends because I heard about it through somebody at work, and I ended up just falling in love with it. And I did it for 3 years. I was with Second City. I did their sort of starter program, and then I auditioned for and made the conservatory, which is still like a training program, but you're training to get on the main stage. And then I also did Improv Olympic or IO theater, which teaches long form. So it was this whole hobby, and I met all these really amazing, cool people, checked the box on making friends, but also just really look back on that time fondly. And I think it definitely has influenced writing. As improv comedy, it is essentially making up a story as you go. And if you're sitting in the audience watching an improv show, especially long form improv, it looks like just chaos, and that the actors on stage are just magically coming up with this stuff. But what you don't realize is there's actually a method behind it. There is a framework that they are acting in, even though they're getting suggestions from the audience and making jokes and telling stories from those suggestions, there's a framework behind it. And writing is very much the same way. There's a structure to your plot, even though you don't maybe know where you're going along the way. So I think improv likely has probably helped me, that process I was talking about where I have a couple of scenes that I'm going towards. There's a very similar thing with improv. You've got a structure that you're going towards and you just have to kind of find your way there. It's
Yeah, that, now that you mention it, that actually makes a lot of sense. That sort of, what maybe like point 1 is, and what point like 5 is, and what point 10 is, but you don't necessarily know how you're going to get from one to the other. And that's the way I do it as well a lot. Too, I don't necessarily plot out everything that's going to happen in my story. I might know what this plot point is, and I might know what this plot point is, but what I don't know, what I never know, is how I'm going to get from one to the other. And that's definitely an improv skill. That's really cool for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of trial and error too. And you're wrong, you go back and you try it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, when you're on stage, you don't necessarily get to go back and redo. So that's the nice thing, I guess, the thing that writing sort of has over live improv certainly is that if it flops, you're not stuck with it.
Yeah, the power of the key.
Right. You can delete and be like, oh, that didn't actually work out as well as I thought it would. So other than signing up for an improv class, which is great. I always tell people when they ask me like, what's your best advice to give writers? One of the things I always say is, if you want to learn how to write dialogue, read plays. Plays are great to read, I think, to learn how to write dialogue, because in a play that's all you have. You're so dependent on that. What advice would you have if you could speak to, and I'm sure there are writers out there who are watching and saying, oh man, I'd like to be the one there someday soon, with my book making its debut. What would you tell them?
Well, first I'd say the play advice is great. I have not tried that, but it makes a ton of sense, because you've got to have lively forward momentum dialogue that doesn't sound weird and stilted, and plays certainly do that. So I'm going to take that advice. But I would say, first and foremost, find a group of like-minded writers. I talked about my critique group, but I think that was a game changer for me. Going from, that over a decade ago, trying to cobble together these books that never really went anywhere. Once I joined this group of other talented writers, they really helped me see what's working and also what's not working. And I've just learned so much, not only from their feedback, but also from giving feedback. There's something to be said about listening to other people's work and trying to say, how do I make this better? So find a group of like-minded writers. And what I mean by like-minded is somebody who is on a similar place in their journey. We all started off unagented, unpublished. Many of us hadn't even finished our first book. And we've been together now for many, many years and been on that journey together. And it helps that we were coming from that same starting point, because we had similar goals and lessons to learn and to teach each other. So that I would say is number one. Number two, I would say read a lot, read inside the genre that you want to write in, and then also read outside of it, and treat it almost like a study. If there's a book you're reading and you love it, say, what is it about this book that is working? And if you're not loving it, what would you do differently? What is it that's not really connecting with you? And take those as lessons. And then the third piece is just don't give up. Writing is, who likes a book and doesn't like a book is highly subjective. And like you mentioned, most writers don't land their very first book, or sometimes even their second or their third. Most of us have these long journeys to talk about. So stick with it. Don't give up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that bit about the critique group is so helpful, because I think a lot of times we think, well, once we've done it, then we know how to do it, and we can kind of be out on our own. And I can tell you, as someone who's doing it the second time, like, that critique group is still so important and so helpful. So yeah, that's absolutely stellar advice. And so before we finish up and move on to the Q&A, just real quickly, what are you working on now that you've gotten through debut day and this one is out in the world? Where do you go from here? What's next?
Yeah, always on to the next. Fortunately, I do have another book coming out. It will be back half of 2023. It's another speculative thriller. This one I would I would liken it to, it's sort of like a speculative version of I Know What You Did Last Summer. It's about a girl who can see when somebody is in danger because she sees dark clouds that no one else can see hovering above their heads. And she always saves somebody, or always is saving people, until she one day saves the wrong person and causes a tragedy to happen. And someone figures out what she's done, and they want revenge. Dun, dun, dun.
Ooh, that's very intriguing. I love that. That sounds really exciting.
Jenny and Stacy, thank you so much. This was really great. So I wanted to say we have a few questions, and if you have questions, if you just want to put them into the Q&A part of the Zoom chat. And I also wanted to say that we do have the books available, and I know Stacy would be like totally excited to come and sign a book to you. So you can order them online at www.ggpbooks.com. And so I'm going to read the questions to you. Our first question is from Marisa Brown, and it says, did you have a scene that was really fun to write or that was particularly difficult to write?
Yeah, I think, well, the fun ones, I think I captured with hopefully the earlier one. The scene that was difficult to write. Yeah, I'll go back to that what's in the crate, but only because there's some pivotal moments of the mystery that took me a little while to figure out, to make sure that it was satisfying. I think one of the things I like to do that I think I'm pretty good at as a writer is doing the buildup, but sometimes my initial attempts at what am I building up to are not as compelling as they could be. So making sure that I'm building up to the right reveal, what am I revealing was a challenge. And there were a couple of scenes. Now, once I figured it out, the rest of it fell into place. But it took me a little while in those early drafts to figure out what is the secret and the mystery, which may surprise people, because I think a lot of people might think you go mystery first and the rest of the book follows. But in this instance, it was magical power, some kind of mystery. I don't know what it is. And then I meandered my way a little bit while I figured it out.
So I'm going to have a question that from me. Was there any character other, I'm not your lead protagonist for both of you, that kind of got in your head and really wanted to be bigger than you had intended them to be?
Yeah, well, I'll say Manuela was definitely that character for me. She was loud, proud, and wanted me to turn the story into hers. And she was a lot of fun for that reason. And also, I'll also add Vivi, the character too. She also started to play a bigger role in the mystery, which in the book, she is Lucy's mom's best friend from back in the day, who was really running the day-to-day operations of the memory house. And initially she was just going to be this annoying woman, but then she started to also play a bigger role. So she also was a pleasant surprise that popped a little more on the page than I expected. I know, what about you, Jenny?
Yeah, when I first, and I was exactly like you in that the first thing that came to me about Dark and Shallow Lies was this town and the ability of these people. I did not necessarily know what the mystery was that had taken place there, but I knew it was the setting and that world that sort of came to me. But the first character that popped into my head was not my point of view character. The point of view character in Dark and Shallow Lies, her name is Gray. And she is not the first one that came to me. The first one that came to me is one of the other kids in the town. His name is Hart. And he is the one that sort of came into my head first and whispered in my ear. And I really fell in love with that character. And I still really love that character a lot. And I just felt like I knew him really well. And so he's the first one that came to me. And I kind of built out from there.
Then we have a question from Lisa Ramey. You're so good at writing evocative sentences. Does this come naturally?
I guess it does. No, I've always loved a pretty line of words. When I was a kid and I first really started getting into reading novels, not to date myself, but I was really into like Christopher Pike, who is a mystery writer from back in the day, that just when I discovered his books, they sort of opened up this whole new world of what books could be. And I would underline lines that he wrote that I just found very beautiful. And then I would also sometimes rip them off into very poorly written poetry that I would submit to my writing class in high school and in junior high, very bad poetry. But so I think that probably influences just that love of pausing. And I like to have a fast moving story, but pepper it in with some tight, but hopefully very evocative sentences.
Okay, then we have a question from Robin Bald. What is the one thing that didn't make it into the book that you hoped would have, and why?
Oh, that's a good question. What didn't make it into, there are a lot of, speaking of evocative lines, there are a lot of lovely lines, my darlings. There's a phrase in writing called kill your darlings, because if they're not moving the story forward, they don't actually have a place in the story themselves. So there are a lot of beautiful lines that never made it into the book for all the right reasons, because they were lovely words that did nothing for the story. I'd have to go, I'm trying to think if there's one that pops off the top of my head, and nothing is coming at the moment. But I know if I was to go back and look at some of those early drafts, there would be some beautiful chapters that would make me very sad to have lost.
Okay, we have a question from, it's written by Kath Rothschild, but it's actually from Kara. And it's, what is your favorite character from a thriller and why?
Oh, like any thriller in the whole world. Yeah, I can't remember the character's name, but I was talking about those early Christopher Pike books that were pretty impactful. And the first one of his books that I read, it was my first time going into the young adult section of a bookstore and picking out my own books, where before that, my mom would give me books and books would come to me through school. So this was my first, I am shopping for myself in elementary school. And the book was Chain Letter, about these kids who did a bad thing, and they start getting these chain letters that tell them they basically know, somebody knows what they did, and if they don't do this thing, bad stuff will happen. And I can't remember the character's name, but the one who is actually behind all of the bad stuff stuck with me on it. It was such a, I couldn't figure it out until the very end. And I remember it being so shocking, no, not that person. And then you realize what their motivation was and why they did it. And it was, I'm sure if I went back and read it now, it would be so obvious who the bad guy was. But in my young mind, it just did such a good job of hiding the truth from me that it stuck with me. And when I would write practice books and practice stories as a kid, I was always trying to trick my readers the same way that character tricked me. And I think that's probably a large reason of why I like to write mysteries and thrillers today.
Okay, we have two questions from Selena Wing. And the first one is, she says, congratulations on today's launch, Stokes. If you could talk to the 5 years ago, Stacy, what would you say to her?
I would say, don't give up, keep going. It's going to happen, just not on the timeline that you want it to happen on, which, we all think, Jenny, maybe I shouldn't say we all, you tell me if you agree with this or not. I remember oftentimes I'll finish the first draft of a book and be like, it's here, who wants to love it? And then you try to read it and you turn out that you discover that it is a pile of crap that needs to be completely rewritten. So 5 years ago, I was probably holding on to a working draft of this book thinking, who wants to love it? And the answer is nobody, because it was really bad. But thankfully, I didn't give up. I don't know, Jenny, if you've had that experience.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely accurate. I remember Dark and Shallow Lies is my first published novel, but it's, as in most people's case, not the first one that I wrote. And the first one that I wrote, I wrote it. It was just, had just finished the last chapter and went to a conference, a writer's conference, and there was an agent there who was, like a rock star, superstar agent who was like, oh, I love this. And, I talked to her and I was like, oh my gosh, she loves this. I'm going to have an agent by the end of lunch and it's probably going to be published by next week. And my life is set. And of course it did not work out that way. But that encouragement from that person in that moment was the first time that I really said, hey, I think I might actually be able to do that. So it was certainly a valuable experience. But it never works out as quickly or as easily as we really hope it's going to.
Okay, we have another question from Selena. You talked about how Manuela surprised you? Do you have any characters who really stayed true to who you originally met when you first started this journey?
Yeah, I'd say Lucy. I was outside of her almost getting overshadowed a couple of times by the side characters. I had a pretty clear sense of, I knew that she wanted to get out of her small town and that she wanted nothing more in the world than to take memories away from people, unburden them, and help them get rid of these sad things that have happened to them. And that by the end of the story, those two things were going to completely, her whole world was going to be rocked, and those were no longer going to be her two goals. And I knew that she had a dream of traveling, and that this goal of traveling was tied to the loss of her mother, and that would become a big theme throughout. So I talk a lot about license plates and maps, and use references to locations, and she compares a lot of people to locations that she dreams about going. So all of those things really remained unchanged. The words have been polished and some of them cut and rightfully on the cutting room floor, but she's stayed pretty true to what I first imagined.
So Sally has a question for you, and may I congratulate you, Sally, about getting your book deal. And I read it. It's very exciting. I just shared with them earlier that you wrote my resume 20 years ago that got me GGP. Okay, on that note, we'll go back to her question. Once your book was accepted for publication, what surprised you the most about the publishing journey?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, the biggest surprise is, and apologies if you guys hear my baby saying hello in the background, if that picks up. I think that first moment, so to get to publishing, you do a lot of revisions, right? We talked about that first draft being total crap and having to go away and revising with the critique group to get it polished. And then once I signed with my agent, we did another revision, and she really helped elevate with my agent, and she helped elevate the story. And then you think, this thing is great. How is an editor actually going to make it better? And you get an edit letter. And my edit letter was many, many pages. And my first reaction was to panic and look for a paper bag to blow in and ask if maybe I should have to give back the advance. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can revise it again. But then after the panic sets in and I read through it, I realized I can make the story even better. And my editor pulled things out of the story that I just never would have considered had it not been for the thoughts that she had. In fact, the initial story was really primarily focused on Lucy's journey and Marco's journey and their mystery. And it was through my editor that we added the more around the town and the mystery around, which just adds a whole other layer of richness. So it's hard for me to imagine the book that she read initially being out in the world, because I'm just so proud of where she brought it, and so amazed at what she was able to pull out. And you just don't know it until you go.
Editors are amazing, right? I mean, that's such a special skill to be able to see that in somebody else's work and bring out those things. That's really cool.
Yeah, it was amazing. And also copy editors are amazing humans too. You have to have like a PhD in commerce to get that job. So it's like my primary editor, and all of the editors, that really does take a village to bring a book into the world. So huge thank you to the entire team.
And we have a question from Andrea Lee. Do you have a favorite routine or setting to help you get into the zone for writing?
Yeah, I walk a lot. Actually, the article that made it into our local Montclarian talked a lot about me walking, but I do it for exercise, but it also just gives me space to think a lot and work through problems. So usually when I'm writing a book and thinking through a new idea, a lot of times getting up and away from the computer and going for a hike or a stroll and just sort of letting my imagination run wild helps me solve some of those writing dilemmas or think through what comes next. It's actually my favorite part of the writing process, is when I've got a kernel of an idea and I'm just trying to think through what comes next.
Okay, this is from Robin Bald again. She wants to know, which actress would you want to play Lucy in the movie adaptation of your book?
I knew somebody was going to ask this, and I had an answer and now I don't know. The problem with writing young adult novels is the actresses age out of it so quickly. But my initial, when I was writing the book, I watched the show, I think it was called Unbelievable, which is a really good show. It was out a number of years ago. And the woman who plays the main character in that would be perfect. And I can't remember her name, and I should have looked it up before this, knowing that somebody was going to ask that question. But if you look up the movie Unbelievable and you see that woman, she's great in that. She's pretty, but in like a non-obvious way. She plays that from a small town, kind of unassuming, I think, really well. That would fit Lucy perfectly.
Okay, and here's a question from Selena Wang again. I don't know about you guys, but I'm a huge rereader. I will revisit books on a regular basis. If I like a book, I usually reread it at least once, sometimes twice. So she wanted to know if either of you reread books, and if so, what are some of the books or stories you keep returning to?
Yeah. One of my all-time favorite authors is Maggie Stiefvater. She writes beautiful, speculative, weird, wonderful stories. And the book of hers that I've read several times is The Scorpio Races.
That's a great book.
Oh, I love it. First of all,
I've actually read it twice too.
Oh, it's so good. It has one of the best first lines of a book of all time, but she just does setting so well. And it's essentially a story about horses that eat people, which is not the best way to talk about that book, but it's written in this beautiful lyrical way with these amazing characters. And these horses are both terrifying and beautiful at the same time. And I just, if I could steal somebody's book and write it, it would be hers. And then I'll say one book that I am definitely going to reread that I've not yet reread. Jenny, is yours. I love Dark and Shallow Lies. I know I said that at the beginning, and I was so thrilled when you not only blurbed the book, but agreed to be a part of this, because all those things that I love about that book with Maggie, the setting, the magic, just the uniqueness of it, I think your book has as well.
Oh, thank you. That's really sweet. That means a lot to me. I appreciate that. I personally am not really a big rereader, and I hate to admit that, but I am one of those readers that reads to find out what happens. I am so focused on what happens, and that once I know, I don't really go back and reread unless there's a specific reason. Sometimes I'll go back and reread if I'm working on something and I remember a certain part of a certain book that might, give me some sort of push with that, or might be helpful to that, or that seems similar. I might go look for a certain chapter, a certain passage, or a certain scene to reread. But I'm not, gosh, I really can't think of anything that I've read in its entirety again once I know how it ends.
Well, I have to confess, I have a birthday coming up, so I was thinking about, because your books are both YA, and I've been reading a lot of adult books since the last couple of years, not as many YA as I normally read. So I kept thinking about the very first one that kind of rocked my world when I was 9 or 10, and it just kind of sat in my head. So last night, as a birthday present for myself, I went on Abe Books, and I found a copy with the same cover that I read when I was 9 years old, and I bought myself that for my birthday.
Oh, nice. So
I'm looking forward to rereading that probably for the 30th time, because I think I read it at least 29 times when I was.
So what is it? What are you going to tell us what it is?
It's called Run, Shelley, Run by Gertrude Samuels.
Oh, I don't know that one.
1975. And it was one of those books I found on my older sister's bookshelf and stole. and continued to read. I reread it until it fell apart. That's the kind of reader I was as a kid. I would reread them until they fell apart.
You have to see if it stands the test of time.
I know, but I just figured that I wanted to do something special. I mean, not that it's a big birthday or anything, but I was thinking, what do I do? It's my third pandemic birthday, so you can't really have a huge party. And so I decided I was going to find the 3 books that kind of rocked my world when I was
That's cool.
preteen. And I ended up buying all 3 of them, and they will all arrive within a couple days of my birthday.
Nice.
Awesome. That's really cool.
So
happy early birthday.
Yeah, I plan on doing that for rereading. But we do have more questions. We have one from Lisa Ramey again. You said in this book, setting came first. Is that typical, or is character more often your starting point?
I'd say for me, concept is actually my first starting point. I usually come up with, the moment of, wow, what if somebody had a business around memory taking, and then usually characters follow. Although this is a book where that setting definitely played a huge role. When I thought of the concept, I think I went setting then character, but usually it's concept and then who is this going to happen to? Yeah. And I know, Jenny, if you have similar.
Oh yeah, mine was definitely setting. Like I mentioned, for Dark and Shallow Lies, and it was also really setting for the second one that's coming out in the fall. So I think setting is probably something that I'm really just drawn to as a writer and as a reader too. Absolutely, like I said.
Yeah, I'm excited for that second book.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, ladies. We have a question from Lenore Paula Weiss. Can you talk about what happened after the first draft? Where did you go from there?
Yeah, taking me all the way back. So I should say the first draft was a half-written concept that was very bad and terrible. I initially thought this was a middle grade book, which, first of all, I've never written the middle grade. I've always written older, and I share that because I know my critique group is laughing because when I brought the pages to them, this is a middle grade book, they were just laughing at me because the voice was too old, the plot was all wrong, everything was wrong. But what I did have in there was the kernel of the idea around the memory house where people come to forget, and this idea of a secret that is unveiled in that first moment where Lucy tries to take a memory. So that piece worked. All the other stuff around it was completely wrong. So then I went back to the drawing board and I kept the kernels of what was working and ended up crafting an entire first draft. And I brainstormed with them a little bit around what is working and how might I fix that. And then once I got that completed first draft, it was really around just improving the plot, improving the pacing, improving the mystery to make it more and more compelling. But the bones were there. And there's actually quite a few scenes that remain pretty similar. In particular, the opening scene remains pretty close to the very initial opening scene. Once I figured out where I was going, that remains pretty unchanged.
We have one last question from Gabe Martinez. Has the pandemic affected your creative practice, and what are your thoughts on writing about it?
Yeah, so it definitely gave me more time. The second book that will be coming out next year, a lot of the revision that I did on that, which that one was actually a book that I wrote many, many years ago, put away, thought it would never see the light of day, and then decided to resurrect it and revisit that entire plot. All of that was done during the pandemic. And I think because you couldn't really go anywhere and do anything, I was able to get a lot done with that story that I otherwise wouldn't. I talked about walking and thinking about stories. Gyms were closed, friends were closed. So I was doing a lot of walking around I was living in San Francisco at the start of the pandemic, and now I live in Oakland. I was just doing a lot of walking and thinking and needed an activity. So the pandemic definitely gave me space and time to think about that. And as for writing about the pandemic, I don't know. It still feels too soon. I have a thing where I like some distance between real events. Like there's a lot of shows on Netflix right now, like the Thanos story. There's one about WeWork. There's one about Uber, and I'm like, it's too soon. All that stuff just happened. I need some time and distance. So maybe someday writing about the pandemic or letting it trickle into my writing, I'll be ready for it, but it's too soon.
It also feels tricky. Like, I don't know how I would write a story about me sitting on my couch for a year and a half and watching Netflix and like trying and failing to make cinnamon rolls is basically what that would be a story about. I don't know. That's a hard thing.
The grocery store's out of toilet paper.
Right.
How do I make bread?
Yeah.
Well, ladies, this has been really a delight. I wanted to remind everybody that later this week, we're going to invite Stacy in to come sign books. So if you would like a book signed to you, we do ship. It's available at www.ggpbooks.com and just put in Stacy Stokes and her book comes right up. And in the message area, put who you'd like it signed to, and we will have it signed to you. And you can either pick it up at the store or we can ship it. So it's your call. And You know, this was really a lot of fun. This was our first event in a while, and what a wonderful way to start the season.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to do a plug too for Jenny's book, Dark and Shallow Lies. Order it through a great place.
Jenny will we'll figure out a way to get book plates.
Absolutely, yeah, glad to do that.
Or what we can do is, if a bunch of people order them, we can ship them to Jenny, and we can ship them out.
I've got book plates. I can send you book plates. I'm glad to do it. I'm really honored to have been a part of this evening, Stacy. I know I told you how much I love this book as soon as I read it. So really glad it's out in the world, and can't wait for more people to get it and take a visit to Tumble Tree.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say thank you too. There's a lot of friends and family on the call who just thank you for all the wonderful messages of support and well wishes. And thank you again to A Great Good Place for Books. I would encourage everybody, whether it's my book, Jenny's book, or another book, to purchase and support this wonderful bookstore. And then my one shameless plug would be, if you like Remember Me Gone and you wouldn't mind going and leaving a review, it is the best gift you can give to an author, because
So important.
People discover books. It drives the whole algorithm on Amazon. So if you could just take a couple of minutes to go online, write a couple of words, even just, I liked it, and some stars.
You know, and also don't forget to review it on Goodreads.
Yes, Goodreads,
Absolutely.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all the places. Thank you to everyone. I really appreciate it. And to my agent and my editor, thank you.
Well, good night, ladies. Let's virtual clap.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks for everybody for coming.